Anyway, it's good to welcome Julian Hooper here to talk about his painting, so let's do that.
Thank you, Sam. Kia ora tātou, malo, hi and welcome. This talk I'm going to give is essentially a look at drawings that I've made over many years, and with an emphasis on the methodology there rather than the paintings. There are paintings in this presentation, but they're mainly there to serve as evidence of an outcome of the drawings. So I won't be talking so much about the meaning and the content, themes and subject matters of my work. It's more a sort of studio methodology. Most of the images in this presentation I've never shown in public before. Hopefully they'll be interesting. There's a lot of scanned sketchbooks and studio shots. So I'm going to take you back to when I was 13 and 14 years old and did a fairly intense series of portraits of my family. This is somehow relevant to what I do now. It was quite an intense period of observation and representational drawing, and set up a platform for everything I've done since, in a way, and maybe highlights the way that I've eventually arrived at some position of abstraction, some way of painting abstract paintings, but very much from a representational or figurative perspective. This is a portrait of Facet Burnett, who was my mother's third cousin twice removed. He was a guy who my mum knew back in her university days, and then when I was about 7 or 8, he discovered that we were related. So his family got in touch with ours and we became very good friends. They were all painters, Facet, his wife Huya and his son Tom, and they lived up in the Bay of Islands. They would come down for Facet's exhibitions back in the 70s, and we would go up there and holiday in the Bay of Islands. He is in a way responsible for this series of drawings because he came home one day with 5 sketchbooks and threw them around the table and suggested that we all start drawing. I never stopped. I started, I guess, fairly tentatively. This is a drawing of my father's chair and his ashtray. And I pretty soon honed down this cute little signature. These was kind of very innocent, pre-adolescent times. And it's very nice for me to look back at these drawings. A lot of the things in them are still there. The heart-shaped silver toast rack, the curry pepper grinder, the salt and the mustard. My father became a very good subject for me. He had a very distinctive face with the beard and the side parting and the droopy eyes. And after a hard day at work, he was quite happy just to sit still. So there's lots of images over that 2-year period of him watching Magnum PI or something. But it was very much about chasing this idea of a good drawing. How do I make a good drawing? How do I come to grips with hands and knuckles and drapery and a likeness? All of the drawings are line drawings, and this I've sort of realised is because a few years earlier we were staying in a house in London for a few months, and there was a book there on Utamaro, and I had these fine-tipped felt pens and I copied every single page of this book. Very linear type of work. And so when I started drawing from our friends and family, that line was a very prevalent aspect to them. I remember the watch, the Olympic watch. Dad would often pull his turtleneck up over his mouth for some reason. These sketchbooks also have these rather comical drawings in it. This was me making fun out of my dad's attempt, well, probably very good attempt, to build a compost heap. these are quite good likenesses of him, if I do say so myself. Often he would ham it up. But I'm grateful to him and my mum for sitting patiently. My mum was harder to draw. She didn't have such caricaturable features, although the Tokelau pearl lure pendant became a bit of a trademark. So there were a lot of these drawings, which is why I'm showing a lot of them, but I'll go through them rather quickly. When I started drawing, I think in, I guess you call it year 12 now, sixth form, this is my brother Matt. Matt was a little easier to get down. He's got really big lips, so if I got the big lips on, then it would look like Matt. He had a kind of bowly haircut too. But he was often drawing as well. This is Facet, and there's a number of drawings of Facet here. Facet was very, very encouraging to me. He was one of those sort of exuberant, extroverted guys who would dish out praise in an extraordinary, generous kind of way. So he praised me a lot about how I was drawing, and that kind of made me want to draw more. I think it was very lucky, very fortunate for me to have someone like a mentor who wasn't my father. Often, I think when a kid is being told what to do by their dad, they kind of react against it, but when it's someone else who they can understand, it's a great thing to have. So Facet would also be drawing on many of these evenings, and Tom and my brother Matt, and it would become quite a competitive sort of environment. This is a view of Facet's kitchen up in the Bay of Islands. That's one of Facet's paintings, fairly typical of what he did. He would go out on his boat, which is a mullety, or he would go driving in his trekker up through the Northland Hills and take photographs on some little Instamatic camera that would then stitch together into these panoramas and make paintings. Remember rugby jerseys, striped rugby jerseys? He would also get very drunk. And very hungover. He would have couch days where after we would go out on the boat for a few days. And it was a humble mullety, about 18 foot, and would have like 3 kids sleeping right up in the front, and then Facet and my dad, maybe my mum, Tom, sort of carked out further down and go fishing. Great times, but he would be exhausted having organised all that when we came home again. This is son Tom Burnett, who's an artist as well, and who became a really good friend of mine, and we've done a lot of travelling and drawing together. That's Tom drawing somebody after dinner one night. Facet's wife, Huia, great painter. Huia and Facet both died. Tom's alive and well, living in Rotorua. There's a still life on my parents' table, and I recall that book, Picasso, a retrospective from the Museum of Modern Art, open at one of my favourite Picasso pages at the time, Sleeping Peasants. There's quite a few still lifes, very much about just sort of fascinated with perspective and overlapping and how to get everything down right. There's a whole lot of printmaking books that Facet turned up with one day, lying around the living room. It's a batch we used to use out at Karikari. I suppose I'm also using this part of my talk as a bit of biographical introduction. That was my Tokelau hat. We spent a number of years in Tokelau when I was a kid. The headband says, Ngā lue matatalo, which means work and pray. When I started school, taking art at school in the sixth form, I remember teachers telling me that drawing in this linear way was wrong, that the world isn't made up of lines, it's made up of edges between forms. So I stopped drawing with a line and started shading. And then I got sick of that, and a couple of months later I went back to line drawing. And it's been my kind of main way of working through things ever since. Judith Huntsman. I'd be drawing at dinner parties of my parents, wouldn't understand what they were talking about, but really enjoyed the kind of compositions of people grouped around. It's my great aunt Mary. Gerard Friedlander, it's Marty's husband, who would come around and eat all our feijoas. And there he is again watching TV with Matt and Dad. Some random guest. My granddad, who we called Bulla, he lived in Fiji. And when we were kids, we couldn't say Basil for some reason, so we just called him Bulla. He'd say Bulla when he crushed our hands when we greeted him. This might be getting on a little later. This would be a school friend, probably 15, 16 years old. I can't remember who Mick was. This is Guy Rupert. I think I was quite pleased with that foreshortened foot. Okay, so jumping forward now to end of the century, 1997 to 2000 was when these drawings were made. So quite a range of ideas in these drawings. They're all done on A4 photocopy paper and pinned up on a big wall I had in a studio in New York, where I was living for 3 years. A number of these drawings were made by looking at a painting that I had kind of fluked one day. It was a painting that I had made by scanning several open books. There was a fashion magazine, a book on model aeroplanes, and a book on architecture. And I was making these paintings by kind of glancing at the books and lifting motifs off. It was very chancy, and just about everything I did was unsuccessful. But there was one painting which really interested me. So I thought, well, I'll do more like that, but I couldn't. So it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And what I did was I sat down with a whole lot of paper, looked at that painting, and made dozens and dozens of drawings about that painting. So the images here of aeroplanes came from that activity. And it was a real revelation for me. My work started to become more abstract, perhaps more open in its interpretation. A sort of comic element developed, something that made me think of Guston at times, Picasso. And it took me a while to kind of understand the implications of this new body of work for painting. It also affected the way I saw the world, because I was still drawing a lot from observation. Particularly in New York, I was spending a lot of time walking around Brooklyn and Manhattan doing a sort of landscape drawing, such as the one top middle. To the extent that I actually started making my paintings copies of the drawings. These next two images are oil on canvas, so they're painted with fine brushes to mimic the pen line. And the diary page was another idea to kind of conceptually complicate the work. And it was also kind of autobiographical. On the 15th of January, I flew off to Mexico and Cuba for 2 months and returned sometime later. So I was interested in ideas of memory, diaries, recording experiences, etc., etc. can't quite recall all the nuances of it, but it seemed kind of meaningful at the time. Okay, here's another jump to 2003, and this was another one of those paintings that I made in the midst of a whole lot of similar sized work, perhaps 30 or 40 large-scale, full-size paper, watercolour, gouache, improvised landscape paintings, kind of painted from imagination, maybe the odd photograph kicking around. But this painting really made me think that something interesting was happening here. The way the forms were arranged in this simple stacking suggested to me that really they could go anywhere. If I can put shapes together like that, I can put them together, who knows how many ways. So it kind of suggested a new way of working, a new way of drawing where I would be able to arrange forms in a more free kind of way. So in this shot you see some line drawings similar to the ones you've seen before, and some of those line drawings are stacking up forms in a landscape idiom. But there are other images here that are just single elements. And what I was doing was I was painting these separate elements on little bits of paper and then photographing them and importing them into Photoshop, where I set up these library files, I call them, with many, many layers or many, many elements in those files, which could then be dragged into digital compositions. So all of those little snippets of hills and cliffs were previously painted and then selected out of the background on the computer and dragged into this file. A 4-month stint in India based in Ahmedabad, where I took my laptop and produced drawings in a similar vein. I think most of these figure drawings were based on photographs in the India Times, I think the local paper, and photographs that I was taking around the place. And again, importing these into these Photoshop files to use later. But even this activity of drawing these figures, you notice that these figures are kind of pretty quirky, some of them. And it again goes back to that process a few years ago where I was scanning 3 or 4 open books or different kinds of images and combining from various sources into one motif. I think this file of figures might have been maybe a good year later. This image shows 4 Photoshop compositions saved onto my computer. You can see that the same elements are there, but I'm refiguring them in different ways. This is 4 of perhaps 20 or 30 with these elements in them. And for every painting that I'm about to show you that came out of this process, there were many, many iterations of a kind of digital exploration which I would carry out and save on the computer and mull over. So there was a kind of prolonged period of deliberation with this process, and I was kind of interested in the idea of, I guess, 2 things. Here's one of the paintings made from one of those prints. I was interested in eliminating the idea of risk from my work. Or you could think of it in terms of annoying risk and good risk. Annoying risk is when you're standing in front of the painting worrying about whether you're going to mess it up or not. There's no real advantage to that. Good risk, I think, is what sort of painting do you want to make and how can that be interesting and edgy and maybe a bit kind of bit wrong, bit right at the same time. So the Photoshop process was one where you can, as you know, go Command Z till you're back to square one. There's no real problem with erasing your mistakes. In the end, this became a detriment, I think, but at the time, it felt really good. The paintings that I made were watercolours, often large scale, and they were meticulously copied from the digital example that I chose to base it on. This was actually an oil on linen, but for all purposes, the same kind of glazed, thin paint technique. For a time, I started to mistrust this Photoshop process for reasons I said before, and thought, well, what if I just put all of these elements out on the studio wall and could scan them, grab them when I needed, and make it up as I go along? It didn't work, but I thought I'd show that slide anyway to show that I was trying that then, and later in this presentation you'll see perhaps that approach working better. This is an exhibition of 5 large watercolours from 2005. There was something interesting about turning these into watercolours, because watercolours, it's a technique where, well, you can paint it in a very fluid way and let it sort of rock and roll, or you can meticulously plan it in a way that I was doing. And there seemed something quite sort of unusual about the way that the Photoshop technique had a very free sort of playfulness to it, where things could be rotated around, moved, enlarged, colours and tones could change. It was all kind of open game, yet once it came watercolour time, everything was set down in a very immutable way that could not be changed or overpainted. During that period, I scarcely picked up a pen or a pencil. Then in 2006, well, the year after that last slide, I started drawing a lot again. I decided that it was time to take on quite a major task, which was to paint a series about my great-great-grandfather and great-great-grandmother, who had a very interesting story, which my father was, in his retirement, beginning to research. My great-great-grandfather was a Hungarian from Dita, Hungary, which was at the time Dita, Romania, or now Dita, Romania, I forget. It was essentially Transylvania. And he appeared, well, he left Hungary sometime after the 1848 revolution. His uncle was a general in the Revolutionary Army who was executed in 1849. My great-great-grandfather Gideon, Count Gideon Vesey, we didn't really know what happened to him after he left, except that he reappeared in Levuka, Fiji in 1870, where he leased land off Mafu, the Tongan governor of eastern Fiji, and set up a South Seas cotton plantation in Vanuatu, which is in the eastern Lao group. And there was a woman who was part of Mafu's contingent from Tonga called Eleanor Blake. And they married and had 4 children. These drawings were sort of kind of me just mucking around, really wondering, reading what Dad was feeding us through these sort of accounts that he would email, wondering what sort of work was going to come from this. I was looking at a lot of stuff from Tongan and Fijian material culture, te whaiwhai, mono, ngatu, tapa, looking for a way in, looking for a way to depict these people who I had no photographic record of. I didn't really know what they looked like. Tota was the name of the land that he leased on Vanuatu. I've never been there. My dad visited. He said it was an extraordinary place. I started to become interested in the idea that I could make up portraits of these people through motifs, a bit like I was doing in Photoshop. So this sequence of drawings shows one of the first developments of a portrait face out of motifs of a frigate bird and some tapa motifs, and bats for eyes. The bats for eyes became quite a significant part of this series because Vesey had to leave the plantation because of some terrible eye trouble. Not quite sure what it was, but it was pretty bad enough for him to have to leave for 2 operations, and he was gone for 2 years. And when he came back, his wife Eleanor was in with the local chief. So he, it's a long story. I won't go into it. It's fascinating, but it's another story really. But hence the blind bat eyes. This is fairly early days in the or maybe midway through the project. I was working toward exhibiting this at the Auckland Triennial in 2007. Basically pumping out quick watercolour paintings. Putting them on the wall and wondering how the heck I was going to bring it all together. But the old line drawings really took off with this notion of making up the face out of shapes and elements that came from various significant resources to do with the lives of these people. So the face on the left with the frigate birds and the curved build something or other. Face on the right with waves, made up of waves. A kind of geometric triangular form that I find hard to shake off. It's in a lot of my work. The idea of the border came from Te Whaiwhai quilts, perhaps tapa as well. Bat wing shapes in the clothing on the left. A few sort of hibiscus or frangipani petal forms kicking around. This sort of swastika shape's called the manulua. It's a very prevalent motif in Pacific Island. And it also kind of echoes the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was another aspect of this project, was the kind of crossover between motifs from Pacifica and Old Europe. This is one of the exhibitions of the series, which I honed down to about 36 paintings. This was at the Monash Faculty Gallery in Melbourne in a group show there. Here are some detail shots of individual paintings. I was using collage as well. But these very much came from the line drawings that you saw before. The text of the title is also written on those black sort of tear and speech bubble shapes. Again, I won't go into the narrative here, but collaging as well. I think the eyes and the eagle and the waves up the top were cut out from another painting and stuck onto this one. It was a sort of way of having a second chance with watercolour. Pinning things onto the work on the wall for weeks at a time before deciding to commit to the glue. Here's a photo I took yesterday before coming down of all the remnants of that process, which is many years ago now. Yeah, those are the bits that never made it onto the paintings. The following year, I went through pretty much all the sketchbooks I'd made for that previous series and noted down all the motifs that seemed to be operating in them onto 2 large sheets of paper, so that they were now out of the sketchbooks and on the wall and I could see them. And I used these pieces sort of like Lego blocks really to build a series of portraits for a show at the Dunedin Public Art Gallery, which were designed to fit antique frames belonging to the Otago Settlers Museum. So there was kind of a cute sort of retrofitting activity going on here of painting a kind of traditional portrait but in a modernist sort of idiom to fit an antique frame. I'm going to show you quickly some line drawings from the sketchbooks and how they developed into painting works. These were often referencing early 20th century or 19th century photographs. One of a standing woman who had this sort of crazy forward lean to her that I found it fascinating. Here using some motifs from Tongan ngatu. There was a photograph I found of two women holding hands, and it seemed to suggest this beautiful symmetrical design, and it took me a while to kind of hone in on it, but over a number of drawings I was sort of looking to extract some kind of order or beauty to the image. Some drawings from a book on architecture, which suggested to me torsos and standing figures, and then informed this painting, the male figure on the left, and this chap. These two works were also preceded by a bunch of sketchbook drawings to try and figure out exactly how everything was going together. And finally, some shots of that exhibition installed. So there was a lot of cross-referencing and research and calculation going on in this project. I continued in this way for a few years, but then it sort of got to a breaking point. I thought, well, I've had a guts full of this. What happens if I just put up a painting on the wall, pick up a brush and paint? Don't refer to anything. Don't refer to any drawings. Don't refer to any photographs. Don't even know where I'm going to go when I start. I produced a show in 2012, which it was tremendous fun to paint, a little bit nerve-wracking at times. I felt sort of like the anchor had been lifted and I was drifting. But these paintings really did evolve through the process of making and submerged under, particularly this image, with several other paintings that I felt were nearly completed, but I would then lose faith in them or not be able to resolve them and would start again. Became interesting in, I suppose, a psychological way, starting to realise that I was having many associations and feelings to do with these images that were emerging. A lot of memories of places visited, of occasions, ideas. Then, at a certain point, I decided to make another one of these by going through the paintings that I'd made in this way and taking the photographs into Photoshop and dragging out elements from those works. And there are other bits and pieces in this file too that come from other people's paintings, maybe some photographic and design sources. And I think a couple of exhibitions later from that first body of work, I was starting to use Photoshop again. You'll see, for instance, the work on the left, top left, is the basis of this painting, which gained a couple of motifs that were from that Photoshop file. Some more work in progress. I can't really talk about the subject matter of these works in any meaningful way, or perhaps I could, but I don't know how to yet. They're too kind of visceral, I guess. They don't really mean anything specific to me, although I do have quite a very close relationship to the image because they've been arrived at through a great deal of scrutiny and consideration, which I'll, if I have time, I think I can show you a sequence soon of work developing. This was kicking off a body of work and realising that I actually needed more motifs for the paintings. I was getting a bit tired of referring to that previous file. Here are some little drawings of elements in the making. This is a video, I don't think I'll show it, it's just of some work, but looking at the clock there, I'd rather move on. Photoshop file of these new motifs. I now find myself wondering if this as an image is better than the paintings. In some ways I think yes, in some ways I think no. I don't know if I could be bothered doing a painting like this. Too many other people do it, and I guess it's, to me, I don't know, it's a bit facile, but maybe I'll come round to it. But to show you again how some of these motifs have entered into the paintings, that sort of rolled over red 9, and that black road stop sign thing at the bottom left were pretty helpful in resolving this work. That strange, craggy, black, fossil-y thing became quite a dramatic element in this painting. The background of this painting was pretty much the obliteration of another work, and the addition of the two elements of that, the sort of craggy black skull form, jawbone, and the bright primary coloured frame over the top were a nice counterpoint to that sort of painterly mess underneath. So this is a sequence of slides of a work in progress. I started it with just sort of putting anything on. I quite like that image actually, but sooner or later it had something else put on it. I then set about sort of trying to make sense of how to make this thing work. And the painting hung around at this stage for quite a long time. I thought I was nearly there. These next two frames are screenshots of a file in my computer where I was saving copies of the photo of that work with manipulations with Photoshop over the top. It looks like a lot of work, but I could do 10 of these a night while watching TV. It's sort of like, let's drag stuff on top and see where it lands, maybe move it around a little bit, and try and shake myself out of a way of thinking about a work and put some other spin on it. This is an actual photo. I decided to put this big black cross over it and kind of configure some motifs over the top of that loosely related to what was behind it. Turned it around, put a sort of headlight on it. Decided that was too much, knocked a bit of it off. Quite liked the drips. And I really liked the grey coming through on the sides at the top, which I turned into this form. And now I started to feel like there was something good going on here. I started to feel like I owned this image and it was going to be good. Going back to some of the drawings, that motif on that sort of square thing with the gumboots on the corners fed into this work. To sort of bridge, I don't know, like a framing device. The shape bottom left became sort of the final motif on the work. So there's a lot of history in the making in these paintings. I often wonder if they're resolved, but I quite like that. I quite like the fact that down the bottom of this painting are all the dregs from the first week of its making. Personally, I have associations with the Ahmedabad Drive-In Theatre with its big outdoor screen and the feeling of dangerous open wires hanging out from generators, etc. That's just a personal thing. It probably doesn't mean anything to anyone else. But these are very considered works. They're very small works. I don't see the sense in making them big any more than making them small. I like the fact that they have a kind of intimate scale to them. And each one is resolved, or perhaps I should say, almost resolved in a different kind of way. I quite like that. I mean, maybe the conventional thing to do would be to base a whole exhibition on an idea like this painting, which has sort of set up some idea about making a painting through horizontal bands that then accept new motifs that relate to the motifs behind. But I kind of like making every painting different. I think I'm more interested in establishing sets of rules than I am in fully resolving them and playing them out in a kind of slick way. But I might get to that. This was a few years earlier, a painting that I guess is essentially an abstract painting. But the portrait paintings that I had done so much of were still very much, well, they were kind of surfacing again, and I was wondering how I might improvise work like that, how I might take this process of sort of purely painting and finding the work in the making into portraiture, which was very, very hard. But one of the things I did was I took this compositional idea and laid it over the top of a portrait painting that I'd been working on and pulled it together into this form here. Okay. I'll just quickly go through one more sequence of a painting. So I started making an exhibition of portraits, and I was determined not to pre-plan these, but to let them evolve through making, because I enjoyed the sort of the painterliness of that process, the way that unexpected things would happen. This painting I started off by pretty much copying a late Picasso face, and then putting on a background copied off some book called Painting Now, or Contemporary Abstraction or something, and loaded it up a bit more, added a pink manulua motif, started to look at it, started to wonder how to make this kind of click. So in many ways it looks like a very planned painting, but I don't think I could plan a painting like that. Well, now I'm working on it. I think that's an interesting idea, to try and digest some of these accidents into a more intentioned way of working. This is another painting from that show. It also looks very planned, but it evolved in a fairly kind of, I wouldn't say haphazard, but a little bit chancy, a little bit make it up as I go along kind of way. It always began as a figure of Vlad the Impaler on horseback, but the whole compositional design of the work was something that evolved in a way a bit like the abstract work. I think I'll leave it there. There's about 5 or 6 more slides on a separate drawing project, but perhaps question time. That's right. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Julian.